Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to this fourth breakout session of the Caribbean Urban Forum 2022. My name's Kim Penfold. I'm the moderator for this afternoon session, and we have two, I think they're going to be extremely interesting presentations. One from Christelle Chesney, who's talking about use of performance model and stakeholder feedback in a Caribbean conservation program. And then Joy Best is going to talk about the Fairchild Street Market in Bridgetown. And she says a reverse. It'll be interesting to see what she means by a reverse. Right, I'm going to start with Crystal though. Crystal is a lecturer in the Faculty of Earth and Environmental Sciences with an MSc in Conservation and Rural Development at the University of Kent. She was a Conservation Leadership in the Caribbean Fellow 2017-18 and a Chevening Scholar in 2019. Her research interests are around sustainable alternatives, so sustainable alternative livelihoods, stakeholder engagement, human-wildlife conflict, the perception and attitudinal studies in relation to conservation management and performance. We have some interesting technical challenges with distance across the Caribbean. So we're going to start by playing Crystal's presentation, and hopefully we'll be able to get in touch with her for any questions and answers after the session has reached the end of the presentation stage. So let's watch Crystal's presentation, please.
Christelle Chesney, and I'm really excited to present my work, the use of performance model and stakeholder feedback to evaluate a Caribbean conservation program. So let's get into it. By the way, my name is Christelle Chesney, and I'm really happy to be here. So when we look around at the Caribbean, there's some amazing things to note besides the great cuisine and the culture and the heritage. The Caribbean is one of 35 biodiversity hotspots globally. And what this basically means is that we have an amazing spread of biodiversity. And this means that we have a lot of endemic plants and animals that are only found within this region, which are really important for tourism products, for the spread of life and biodiversity around us, and ecosystem services that we as humans benefit from. But the biodiversity and everything else that we've talked about, our economics, our ecosystem services, and just the variety of life, it's threatened by many things. We have invasive alien species that can reduce their population, natural disasters, anthropogenic activities, and climate change, as we know. Within this Caribbean region, especially the small developing island states are very much prone to losing a lot of the biodiversity, particularly given our climate situation globally. We see things like shoreline erosion, we see things like degraded coastal fisheries, even extreme weather conditions coming from a lot of the threats, particularly that of climate change. And within these smaller island states, a lot of their offshore islands that are very much important for development and ecosystem services are the ones that face a lot of the threats. These offshore islands may or may not be inhabited, but because of the small size and the fact that some of these offshore islands have complex tenureship agreements or private property management, it becomes very difficult to manage these land masses for economic growth, for biodiversity conservation and protection. So with that, it is really easy to lose on some of the biodiversity and the benefits that we get from them. But despite that, despite the vulnerabilities that exist, there are definitely opportunities for innovations to improve the situation. And these innovations can come by way of governmental organizations and NGOs through various conservation strategies, from species protection to reforestation to creation of protected areas. All of this can help in the fight to preserve biodiversity. But although we have this fight, there are some limiting factors. And the major things that limit the conservation efforts that we see right now are, you name it, lack of financial resources and lack of human resources. And that has always been the woes, no matter where you go, that limit the amount of conservation efforts that we can have on these huge land masses that are important. So therefore, it is very important that conservation programs, whether they be run by the government or they be run by an NGO or a CSO, that they are very much prudent with the way that they conserve their resources. And so with that, it is really important that these organizations constantly evaluate themselves. They evaluate their human resources, their management resources, as well as their financial assets. And there are so many different tools that we have to be able to monitor and manage these resources. One of them that was recently derived from a business excellence model is the conservation excellence model. And this was developed by Dr. Simon Black and Dr. Jim Groombridge, persons that I was privileged to have as my supervisors and my mentors doing this type of research. And what they have done is take a business model, the excellence model that's there, and they've been able to redefine it in such a way that we can get the benefits of a business model, but have it in a way to look at conservation issues and to be able to gauge the performance of programs, gauge the performance of projects to improve leadership and to improve management. Now, let me walk you through the model. The conservation excellence model starts off with key approaches, and these approaches eventually funnel into results or outcomes. These approaches start off by examining leadership. It examines people and community management, policy and strategy development, and resource management that all feed straight into leadership. So as we know, leadership would govern how all of these processes are developed. And from those processes, that's how an organization, a project, a program develops its core conservation processes. Now, once those processes and those approaches are developed, that's what funnels into our results. So how well people and community management approaches and processes are developed, that's what will funnel into the people and local community results. The core conservation processes will feed into the biodiversity results, which most conservation projects focus on. Impacts to society as well are results that are important. How does this program affect volunteers, other organizations, people in general that are living in the area? And finally, the conservation program results. The results of the program itself. Has it grown? Has it improved? Has it accomplished the things that it said it was going to do? So using this excellence model, you were able to evaluate holistically the entire program. What's important to note is that this model has been used across the world in other Caribbean states, in the Pacific Islands, Africa, Asia, etc. One thing to note is that the CEM, or the Conservation Excellence Model, is non-prescriptive, meaning that you can use it and adapt it for self-assessment, or it can be used to allow for benchmarking among similar conservation programs. So for this research, three main questions were asked. Can CEM provide valuable insight in the performance of a case study program, given COVID-19 constraints. And the reason for this is CEM is usually done in person. And as we all have experienced, we had 2 years or so where we could not move from where we were. So could a CEM assessment be done from a distance? Could the use of stakeholder feedback enhance CEM assessment, thereby identification of direct problems and critical areas for improvement? And should conservation programs with similar context inculcate stakeholder feedback to assist self-evaluations? And all of this is to see whether or not we can improve leadership and management of these conservation programs for land protection and biodiversity conservation. So to conduct this research, we needed a case study. For the rest of my dialogue about this research, there are a few things I would like us all to know. One, that the case study that we will be using will be anonymized. So the lead organization that we will be talking about, which is an NGO that has volunteered to allow this research to happen, we will term it Great Bird. What you need to know about Great Bird organization is that they're working on offshore islands that are found in a marine protected area, protected by the government, with the government having the only mandate to do so, but not having any manpower or force or program currently active that does so. So this NGO is the only NGO that is doing the work in this area. What is also important is that this NGO is run by a governmental board with an executive officer, and that under this executive officer, we have several program coordinators that run several programs. Now, we could not cover the entire outworking of the NGO for this case study, but we've decided to zoom in on one of their programs, Program X. Now, what's important to note about Program X is that Program X has been doing several things for the conservation of the landmass, the management of these offshore islands, and the protection of the wildlife on these offshore islands. They have been doing a removal of invasive species, education and awareness of the inland population, and they've been doing biodiversity monitoring. And as we can see from the images on the right, they have been doing a spanking good job of restoring offshore landmass to luscious biodiversity area that has now even improved the tourism quality and the tourism product. So how did we go about evaluating the performance of Program X? Well, this was done using 5 phases. The first phase was a desk-based review. Second phase was the collection of social science data. The third phase was the production of a CEM document, an evaluation done by independent assessors, and benchmarking. So let's get into these phases in a little bit more detail so you can understand the processes. Phase 1, Project X has been running for 25 years. However, even with that, we found that there was some missing annual data and report. So therefore, to understand the workings of this project for the last 25 years, a desk-based review needed to be done of all their documents, scientific publications, the MOUs they had, any annual or financial reports that were available, grant reports, newspaper articles, and social media. And this was really important to understand leadership, people management, conservation project approaches, and core project approaches throughout the year. After collecting that data and really understanding on paper what has been going on with the organization, it was really important to take a step further and talk to the people to hear what they have to say. And so a total of 32 in-depth interviews were conducted with internal and external partners to the program. And this purposive sample was done to really understand persons that have a very close and intimate relationship, such as staff, regional and external partners, their views in the program, as well as external partners, such as island owners, community leaders. How did they view this program, since a strong arm of it came from education and awareness? And the thematic areas that were analyzed from these interviews focused on the positive and negative factors that affect the program. Now, after reviewing the document and compiling the thematic areas from the interviews, a report or position document was created. Now, this position document included every single section from the CEM document. So it started off with the results of the program, detailing everything from people and community results, biodiversity results, impact on the wider society, and conservation programs results for the last 25 years, to say these are the results that this program has been able to produce in 25 years, followed by the approaches that they would have taken throughout that 25 years. So their leadership approach, their people management approach, resource management approach, etc. Now, from that position document, the program was then assessed by independent assessors. Now, these independent assessors utilize this rubric from the CEM model to be able to assess the approaches and the deployment of both the results and approach or processes of the program. So, for example, when we look at the approach, how well they manage people, is it the case that their policy for people management was just something that they said? Was it documented? And if it was documented, how did they come up with these approach? Did they use a framework? Was this framework backed by a renowned policy, international accepted policy? Do we see clear evidence of this framework being documented? Do we see clear evidence of this type of framework being used for all people management approaches? For example, for hiring staff, for firing staff, for disciplinating staff, for recruiting volunteers, etc. Are there clear-cut protocols that were designed for this? And are these protocols adaptively managed? Do they get checked after a while for efficiency, and are they improved based on the growth of the program? So that was done for every single process and every single result for the program that was documented. Do we see that? And when it did not have any evidence to back it up, the score could range from 0 all the way to 100. If there was clear evidence of being a systemic approach that was regularly refined, and a systemic approach that was well integrated to all other approaches or processes in the organization. So when we rated Project X, we looked at all their results and their approaches, grading it out of 100 in terms of its approach and its deployment. What is good to note is that each of these criteria, there's a weighting for the category, with biodiversity results having the highest rating. Why? Because most conservation organizations, like I mentioned before, are focused on biodiversity results. That result is then followed by conservation program results, and which is then followed by core conservation processes. So what did we get for Program X? And when we got Program X, when we benchmarked it to 1, 2, 3 other programs that did similar work, what do we see in terms of the benchmarking? Let's find out. So in our findings, we were able to see that Program X had some issues managing financial resources. Their leadership and people management also suffered, And that's what also trickled into their policy and strategy development, which underpinned a lot of the program's performances. Program X out of 1,000 scored 293 for all of its approaches and results. What does this mean? This means that Program X ranked a low performance, and so therefore the management that was happening for this NGO that was taking care of all these offshore islands in a marine protected organization had a low performance. So it means that this organization has a lot of opportunities for improvement. The areas such as biodiversity results, conservation program results, and impact society were definitely lacking, but these were the ones that scored the highest. And the reason for this is that leadership, although it was not a very high score, still provides some amount of supervision to allow these results to occur. However, the areas that really suffered were all of those in terms of policy development, resource management, people and community management, and core conservation processes. And we can see that that all revolved around the fact that people and community results, or the results that govern the staff, the volunteers, and even those in society, were very low. So really our findings highlighted that a superficial review of the documents indicated that leadership was somewhat strong. However, feedback from the stakeholders, staff, and all those involved showed that there are huge inconsistencies in the governance of the organization, and that's what crippled the function of the management of the program. The findings showed that there was a loss of organizational structure that occurred for a long period of time. And this loss of organizational structure definitely hindered a lot of the vision of duties. It hindered their ability to be able to get financial funding, and it hindered their ability to recruit staff and volunteers. And with that, as you know, lack of finances and lack of manpower meant that they really didn't have a lot of staff members to manage the data, to manage the information that was necessary, and to share the findings with both government and their external partners to be able to do things to improve the conditions of these offshore islands. We also saw that although this NGO was doing most of the work and they suffered a big blow, the management of the Marine Reserve was also an issue. This is a government managed marine reserve. So these offshore islands should actually have been managed by the government at that point in time. But like I mentioned before, no management was occurring. There was nobody in charge of the Marine Reserve at that point in time. So there was no support for this NGO. Also, the NGO did not have a mandate to get the work done, so they could not enforce certain things. And that led to a lot of problematic partnerships between this NGO and the government and the international partners, because there was a tug of war with what could be done and what could not be done to improve the situation. When Program X was compared to 3 other organizations that had different years of operation, and they did similar things in different parts of the world, we saw that Program X still, even running for almost as long, or the second running program out of the benchmark, they still did not perform very well. The highest performing program out of the benchmarking session actually came from one that was just recently instituted, a 3-year running program. And we can see the reasons for that. Their scores show that leadership had to be very strong. People and community management was strong. The resource management was strong. And of course, that is what led to that program having a higher score. Leadership, which eventually trickled into the management of people and resources, is what held those projects and brought it up. So this really touches base on the fact that excellence in performance is actually achieved when approaches, core processes, and results are actively managed and improved by an organization. So our findings show that the feedback from the stakeholder was really instrumental for us to really understand the direct problems that were there, listening to everybody that was involved, taking the time out to get their understanding of the program was vital. And when you think about it, there are many, many conservation programs or management programs that exist, that there are core people that have been there from the beginning, from the get-go, from a lot of these programs. And they have a wealth of knowledge, as well as those that have just started. They come with enthusiasm and new ideas, but there's usually not an area or mediator to be able to collect these ideas to really understand negative and positive effects of what's going on with the program. A program could be running for a very long time and it may look successful, but there's so many ways for it to improve once leadership and management improves. And this starts by collecting stakeholder feedback data. It is really important in evaluation processes to move past the documentation, move past the annual reports, move past the financial reports, and really zone into understanding stakeholder feedback to understand all the hicks and the pieces that are underpinning an organization's leadership and management. So therefore, stakeholder feedback, yes, is vital. It is instrumental in understanding discrepancies in governance and management. And this was seen in this case study. Now, you might be saying, oh my, Program X is really in a sore patch. That's true, but Program X is actually on the road to success. This research was conducted and concluded in 2020. The findings of this research was shared with Program X and Greenbird's governing body. It was shared with all stakeholders. And then we had our first steering committee meeting in October 2020 to be able to discuss this entire report and to share all the nuances of the stakeholder feedback with everyone involved. And this steering committee, a new MOU was forged with partners. They have new goals, new vision, new objectives right now. They've even revamped their leadership and their management program. The policies have improved. And I'm very, very proud to announce right now in 2022, a little under 2 years after having this done, Program X is actually succeeding. They have been doing much more work with greater government buy-in now to conserve these offshore islands. So Program X is doing much better, and these evaluations are so important. And it really does stress me to hear from everyone. What they say matters, it really does. This brings us to the end of my presentation. These are my results. Now, I'm very much excited and open to questions, comments, and feedback on the work that I would have presented. And I thank CUF so much for having me here. I also have my contact details listed on the screen for anyone that would like to make contact with me after this. But this was so great, and I'm so, so happy for the opportunity. Thank you so much, and I'll wait for questions.
Crystal, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think there are lessons from it that we can apply across all sorts of fields. And there's the old management mantra that what gets measured gets done, I think is very important there. So having a monitoring system in place and having the results of that fed back into a review of how decisions are made and how the organization focuses on what it's doing is extremely important. But and the fundamental thing that leadership and governance are actually key to organizations succeeding is, I think, something which applies across everything that that people at this conference are involved in today. But I would like to raise one thing with you if you're available on the line, and that actually came out of one of your very first slides, which showed to the extent to which the Caribbean basin is part of a catchment area which stretches in North America up beyond the Canadian border. And that basically reminded me of just how much our environment is affected by what happens in other places in the world, particularly for us, North America. Attitudes in certain of the North American countries towards the environment over the last few years, and the statements that our Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, made last November at the COP meeting in Glasgow about talking to these big countries and telling them what their responsibilities were. And I noticed as I came to work this morning, I was hearing on the radio that the follow-up meeting in Bonn at the moment was not making a great deal of progress. And that led me back to the issues that you raised at the beginning about resources, both in terms of people, staffing, and in terms of the money to pay for things. And I was wondering if you would want to say something at that general level before I ask if there is anybody with a more specific question that they want to ask at this stage. Over to you, if that's possible.
Hi, thank you so much again for having me. Yes, I really believe that is such a good point. I teach environmental education at the university. And the reason I brought that up is only last week, my students and I were saying it is so important for us to understand that we are on one earth, on one globe. And the way that life is, biodiversity, the weather, air, water, is that it's never stagnant. It is always moving around the earth. And so it is very important that we should never think that one event is ever going to be isolated and not affect the other. Things that happen in the Caribbean and small developing states will have an effect on the greater world. It will. And that is why it is really important that focus is within areas that aren't as affected, within areas that still have some amount of biodiversity, some amount of stability to maintain that. Because at the end of the day, I tell my students, we all have to share the same air. We all have to share the same water. And so it is really important that the focus, the provisions, the fundings are provided because we are so connected. Thank you.
Thanks, Crystal. I was going to see if there's anyone in the small audience that we've got here. People have disappeared on a study tour this afternoon to the greatest extent of the conference delegates. And I think they're planning on watching your presentation virtually after the event, which will be when it'll be available to them. And I would certainly encourage them to do so. But I was wondering if I could take one question, if anyone would like to. I've seen everybody scribbling notes, and I've seen people taking photographs of your contact details from the screen. Is there anybody who would like to ask something at this stage? No, they're very, very shy. So in that case, we will move on, and I will introduce Joy Best, who is going to talk about Fairchild Street Market in Bridgetown, with the interesting piece at the end of the title, A Reverse. In introducing Joy, I have to say that I know her very well as a colleague on the Barbados Town Planning Society executive. She's our current treasurer. She works very hard. She has a reputation for asking all the difficult questions, and I think she does that in her daytime job as well. She's made a tremendous contribution to making this event work today, along with members of the more technically adequate people on our executive, which excludes me. And Joy works in Barbados for the Urban Development Corporation, which focuses on the needs of lower income neighborhoods in the city, particularly in a mixture of physical, environmental, economic, and social areas. And she's going to talk about the practical problems of implementing one of their recent projects, which I think might be the clue to what she's talking about in terms of the reverse. But I think it will highlight the importance of involving all stakeholders, including the people who probably think that things just get done to them, rather than having much say in what's happening. So with that, I'll hand over to Joy for her presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. The presentation really is Fairchild Street Market, a rebirth, but I will take the rechristening because we are trying to reverse some of the deterioration that we are seeing in the area of Bridgetown. This is the old Fairchild Street Market in Barbados. It was one very large multi-use building with an asbestos roof that was existing on this site since 1958. It contained butchers, fruit and vegetable vendors, food vendors, but the building over time really began to deteriorate very badly, and the asbestos roof did no favors for anyone. So by the 2000s, the market building was partially demolished because it really became to the point where it had to be condemned. It was not fit for use, and the vendors were moved to an outside car park area and what was then a Probin Street temporary market, which then became a mixture of more traditional market vending and food vending. So we look at then. If you look in the center of your screen, you will see what looks like a shell, the frame of the old market with what became the vendors market of Fairchild Street in the forecourt, in the car park area. The conditions in this market area were very, very bad. So just taking you through what was there to show you how we're improving the situation. The vendors, each person created their own little shanty area, but it was his castle. It was his way of forming, his or her way of making money for their family. Again, more vendors at street level, and we have to juxtapose this to the central bank where we are right now. How do we have a market operating under these conditions with the modern architecture of the central bank in the background? So the Urban Development Commission, UDC, we were requested by Prime Minister Motley to facilitate this redevelopment. And we're linking it towards the Bridgetown transformation process that is ongoing in several other areas of Bridgetown. And to do this, we worked alongside the Markets Division of the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Nutritional Security. The stakeholders. Earlier today in one of the sessions, there was discussion of stakeholders, and it was important to note that every person that could be possibly affected by the market had to be considered a stakeholder, and that is what we did. So we broke our stakeholders into government. Again, there are lots of names on this slide, but every government department we could think of that could potentially be affected, we called in. And then we went to the private sector, and key in this was the association of Barbados Association of Retailers, Vendors, and Entrepreneurs. We Bajans know it as BARVEN. We brought them in at the beginning because we were not building for the vendors, we were building with the vendors. We had a consultant team with a project manager, architect, structural engineer, mechanical and electrical engineer, and a landscape architect. We're not building just for building's sake, we're going to do it safely. So the needs. So when we think back to the structure that was there, what it became, what do we need to make it into now? A minimum of 100 stalls. Again, we still had to include the fruits and vegetable. We still need to include the food and beverage. There are cobblers still existing. Everybody likes to buy lotto tickets. There are lotto booths. Barbers and hairdressers have also set themselves up within this market and other variety stalls. But we also had to consider the butchers and a fishmonger that existed there, and they needed to go into a climate controlled facility, again stressing on safety and health standards that needed to be maintained. So each stall has to have a metered electrical supply and a metered water supply. Safety remains key on our list. Again, this is to make sure that the sanitation in the market, we're dealing with food, the sanitation had to be improved, the stall conditions themselves had to be improved, the site had to be accessible, and it met all food health standards. So food prep sinks, handling of fats, oils, and greases, hot water within these food handling stalls. So the design process, we went through the consultation meetings with the vendors, with the government stakeholders, with markets division. We had an idea of what we wanted. Then we went into a design charrette where we went through and said, okay, if this is what we want, where do we put it? And I must say at this point that when we get to look at the project designs, the vendors themselves chose the design of the site layout. They said what they wanted, and that is what we went with. So this is the architect's rendition. If you look in the center of the drawing, there is a central promenade. The vendors were insistent that they wanted a space that they could use for entertainment, etc., and we took that and we integrated that into it. So the food vendors are there, there's parking, there's a cultural village, we have the butchers, etc., in a facility. So all of these things are listed in this drawing. So these special features that we had to integrate, we are in a hurricane belt. So we had to ask for resilience to at least category 3 hurricanes. We buried utility services to minimize downtime should we have an impact. The roofs are built to a 45-degree pitch, not necessarily for resilience purposes, but we are also still trying to maintain the traditional Barbadian vernacular of the chattel house. So what we did is we're building it in similar to like a chattel house village, where the roofs are pitched at 45 degrees, the buildings are cladded with Victorian plycem to maintain what is looking like a traditional shiplap configuration. There's solar lighting, and the site is connected to the Bridgetown sewer system. So again, we have to go into the engineering drawings. This is just to look at what the configuration was at the time, but as all things, they will evolve. As part of the construction, we broke it into 3 phases because we could not displace the vendors. This site is their major area of income generation. So we broke it into 3 phases. Phase 1, food and beverage, promenade, bathroom facilities, cultural village. Phase 2, fruit and vegetable stalls and the car park. And phase 3 will be the butchers and the fishmongers and the administration building. So color coordinated based on phases. The site itself is small. And in order not to displace the vendors, this is the way we chose to break it down. So phase 1, the central promenade and the cultural village. What we did is we chose to build concrete walls as we're going up, seeing the 45-degree pitch roof. See a couple more shots where we have what was the traditional shed roof type. And then the buildings, the battens are going on, the buildings are cladded. Now, taking a look at it, the vendors have moved into this phase, and this phase is operational. At night, the night shot, the place is a hive of activity. It looks really nice with the sunset in the background, but the lights that you see here are fully off-grid, they're fully solar. Again, other areas on the site. Just a drone shot of phase 1 that has been constructed and is in operation. So for phase 1 status, we've completed the bathrooms, 39 food stalls, 3 general purpose stalls. We've completed a garbage enclosure and the landscaping, and we are wrapping up 5 final food stalls for handover to the vendors. Phase 2. Phase 2 is that area where we see here in green, the area we've identified for the fruit and vegetable, variety stalls, car park areas. Drawing it a little closer to you with some more landscaping, another promenade, because again, we needed to be able to have the site walkable and fully accessible. And we're having several blocks. So we've made sure that we have paths in between so that there are no large expanses of just concrete, there's airflow, all of these things we had to take into consideration on this site. So the concerns with phase 2. Now remember, at phase 1, we had a little bit more room, but now the vendors have moved into phase 1, are in operation. So we have very little space we can work with. we have a lot of contractors because UDC, in addition to providing social assistance programs, we also look at capacity building within the contractors we work with. So we don't work with large contractors, we work with smaller contractors. And as we work, we have integrated those contractors within this project. So again, we have multiple contractors storing materials, making sure that they don't trip up over each other. Dust and noise occurs on construction sites. Again, the vendors are still in operation, so we cannot disrupt them. And then there's parking. The site is in full use. So we had some minor issues in the beginning with the patrons on the site. The status, we have contracts issues. Some are coming to completion. We are awaiting approval for other components, and the work is ongoing. Phase 2 started where we cleared the area where the vendors were in operation. And we have hit the ground running. So we're seeing the floors going in. And then there's phase 3, which is the butcher's facility and the administration facility. This particular one is the one that will take the most time because of the constraints that we have in what is necessary in this area. This facility requires cold storage, frozen facilities, as well as chillers. And these things, as you would understand with commodity pricing and commodity availability at this time, these are long lead items that will be on their way. And if you look at the project challenges, let's be frank, a project like this, we've had a lot thrown at us. Besides COVID, last year, next door threw us for a loop when we had quite a bit of ash. Then we had Hurricane Elsa. And then we had to deal with the price increases. So we started with the budget of X, and then the budget became X plus because of the price increases. The site size has been a limiting factor because we couldn't spread out and do as we wanted and build everything one time and have everybody move in. We need to minimize vendor disruption. It took us about 6 weeks or so between handover of the stalls in phase 1 to full demolition of the vendor stalls, because they had to do things like make utility connections, get their equipment moved over and get themselves set up, because we could not have downtime. Any day these vendors don't work, that is money that does not go into their households. We look at material and labor availability. After Hurricane Elsa, materials became high demand. Everybody needed to make repairs. So construction sites wanting materials for use in their construction had to compete with the people wanting to do repairs to their homes. And multiple contractors. And let's be frank, one contractor can do a program that will work for the entire site. Multiple contractors, multiple programs every day. And we need to work in collaboration with each other, and everybody may not communicate as effectively as they should. And then it became scope creep with other challenges because, again, when we encounter certain problems on site and we need to make adjustments, the scope then ended up changing. That's the end of my presentation. Thanks for having us at the Urban Development Commission. If you want to go, we took a couple people on tour yesterday afternoon, and I think it was very well received. I'll hand back over to Kim now. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much, Joy. I went on the tour yesterday afternoon. I think it's very useful to get the detail behind it, having been there. What I can say, it is a thoroughly lively place. I got accosted by a gentleman who was very disappointed to see that I was drinking water. So, and already with just phase 1 operational, it's obviously a place that's working, and it serves a function in the area, and its location makes it work, and presumably traditionally made it work. So I, again, am going to give Joy one question before I open it up to everyone else, which is really picks up on the fact that in this brochure, the printed program, it does say a reverse. Now, that, two-part question. First part, is that a typographical error? And the second part is, having done what you've done so far, what have you learnt that you might do differently in a similar exercise down the road? You said you wanted an easy question.
The reverse is a typo, but I think that it fits based on having explained it and seen what's happening. We are reversing the deterioration that is happening in that section of Bridgetown at this time, right? So we try to halt that reverse, so it can fit. But the second question, what will we do again differently.
not,
We
yeah.
do differently. That one is a hard one, Kim. That is a difficult question. The challenge is that because there are so many stakeholders that are involved that are important, we can't ignore them. Dealing with multiple stakeholders and hearing their concerns, it may take time, but it cannot be ignored, and everyone needs to have their voices heard. I can't say we can change much. There's very little we can change.
Okay, thank you, Joy. I'm sorry if I asked the difficult question, but always when you do a project, you have to learn for the next one, and I think you would be doing that anyway. I've got a question that's come in on the chat first of all from Petal J. The names are a bit cryptic on the chat. How much, if at all, do you construct with alternatives of green local materials in this project as a means to cut costs and improve resilience?
Barbados is very resource scarce. So what I will say is a lot of our materials, lumber, etc., we have to import. Our local materials that we will use will be the concrete. We do that component. But we also have to take into consideration that we have to import things like fittings, the sinks, the faucets, the water heaters, the lights, electrical cable, all of those things we have to import. We don't produce any of those things here. So all of that contributed to our pricing because Barbados is so resource poor. That is something that we can do very little with because we don't have aluminum here, we don't have bauxite here. So where do we get our materials from?
Right, that's something which applies to every building project in the island, I think. And I know that one of the things which is being stressed at the moment as everybody across the world becomes more and more aware of the problems of supply chains and delivery and costs is that the country is trying to build links across the Caribbean, particularly with timber with Guyana. So that's something which is very relevant to take forward, but to a large degree, we are limited and it slows down projects. And as the costs go up, the longer it takes, the more they go up. It all becomes circular in a very negative direction. Okay, any question from within the room? Right, Robin, please. And please say who you are and your organization.
Hi, good afternoon. Robin Rajak from the Inter-American Development Bank. Joy, I think the answer that Kim was looking for was that you would have delayed the eruption of Mount Soufriere by 2 years or 20.
And COVID.
Indeed. My question goes back to your initial linkage to the Bridgetown Transformation Project. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit about how this project fits into at least the surrounding land uses envisioned by the Transformation Project.
Okay, the Fairchild Street Market is not an official component, but it links with the Golden Square project. The Golden Square Freedom Park was developed as part of the tribute to the freedom fighters and the 1937 riots. And Fairchild Street, by virtue of it's almost adjacent to it. It's almost like if it's the food court to serve that project. So Fairchild Street, when it is finished, will be a direct, they're almost, I don't want to say almost like a 45-degree angle across from one another. So Fairchild Street supports the food and the beverage and that kind of component, and Golden Square supports the event space and the relaxation. Does that answer your question?
The question, Norma, oh, sorry, Robin, you want to follow up?
No, I was just going to say, yes to a degree, but the idea would be to understand for future sub-projects, how the surrounding land uses fit in so that you could even be very deliberate about the connections and the way functionally the larger space would operate. And I think that's what I haven't seen a lot in the public domain as to what the different elements of the Bridgetown Transformation Project would be And given that this is a fairly substantial start, just linking that in conceptually and in terms of spatial use of property in the city.
Okay, Bridgetown transformation, we are looking at the fact that the city itself, treat the city as an organism. Where the city, in order for an organism to exist, it needs to have its cells. And we, the people, would be the cells transporting things through the city, or the vehicles moving the people, the food through the city, the organism. So Bridgetown transformation looks at introducing a lot of green spaces into a city itself that many people say is dying, but it isn't. So these spaces are being created to keep people in Bridgetown, let them increase the safety of Bridgetown, increase the usability of it. Many people see spaces and don't think the spaces are for them. So in doing the Bridgetown transformation project, we are showing persons that many of these areas you can go have a seat at midnight if you want to, and you should be able to feel safe. So Bridgetown transformation really is looking at bringing more people in and keeping them in the city. All right. So it's not just Fairchild Street. Then you look at places like Constitution River Bus Terminal. You look at places like Temple Yard. These are areas that may be seen as misunderstood, misaligned, out of place, depressed, unkept, but these places have a place within our city. So how do we help the people who use these spaces feel that they belong here? So we help upgrade the facility, upgrade the conditions, and bring more people in. Many vendors operate in these spaces. So the vendors have to feel that they are wanted in the city and not pushed out by the operators of Broad Street or Swan Street or the bigger businesses in Bridgetown.
A question in the back of the room, please, next.
Good afternoon. I'm Norma Shorey, and I'm a management consultant. I was really pleased to hear about the many things that you did for the community consultations, to get the communities involved, to get them part of the dialogue so that they would feel happy with what was being developed. I just wondered whether there were any things that you had done specifically related to change management that you could share, because I think that whatever approaches that you might have considered, used, done, or could have done differently would be helpful to other projects that are looking at regenerating cities.
Change management is the hardest component of this project, I do believe. The vendors are accustomed to doing things a particular way in a particular space. And when we were dealing with the transition, the phase transition to have the vendors move into the space, one of the first complaints that they said was, this space is too small. But it wasn't really a case of the space was too small. It was a space that was unfamiliar to them, because in most cases, the space was bigger than what they were really working with. But then we had to explain to them that there are certain rules that they had to operate with. If you are in this particular type of stall, you cannot cook food because it is not equipped for you to safely do so. So then we were able to try to get some training sessions with the vendors through the BTII and Hay Communications, because again, we are working with the government consultants to do training with the vendors, because training was important. The vendors had to feel that they were, and not feel alone, but the vendors were involved, and they couldn't feel that we did it to them. It was with them, and not only for them. We built it for them, but it is with them.
Thanks, Joy. I'm going to take one from the chat then, and then there's a lady in the front row who wants to ask something. It gives her time to reach the microphone. This relates back to the consultation process again, and people are obviously interested in this. Can you elaborate a bit on the consultation process, which you've just done, I think, Joy, but what it then says, and you might want to respond to this, you appear to have got to yes in a short space of time. This is from Grace Lefouris.
Yes, took time. Yes, took time because there are just under 100 vendors who are on the site. But what we did is the consultation started with the vendors' representatives. We could not possibly meet with everybody and do it because of COVID as well. Just as we were really getting the project off the ground, COVID hit. So we try to meet with the vendors and vendors representatives, explain the need for what we need, the regulatory needs. This is what they said we need to have for you. How do we make the regulatory needs work for your operations, and work with that?
And the next question, please.
Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Sonia King. I'm representing part of the UDC team that is supporting Joy on her presentation, and it's an excellent presentation. So I thank her for being a very good steward for the UDC. My question relates to your entire forum, Caribbean Urban Forum, and your theme is Beyond COVID, Recovery, Renewable Resilience. Now, as a part of the process and a part of the project, I'm aware of how the Fairchild Street Market, which started pre-COVID, and we worked with the COVID experience through the project. But Joy, can you share some of the experiences that we would have had gone through when we started, your pictures would have shown the market before COVID, and you would see the transition of the market in phase 1, phase 2. What are the benefits you would see as we go beyond COVID, where we are in phase 1 now, where they came from, this picture that's currently on the screen, pre-COVID, and where they are now beyond, well, we're not beyond COVID at this time, but we're looking forward to being beyond COVID, and how the infrastructure you would have put in, the resilience that is built into the phase 1 and the entire project, and also how they are going to benefit from the new infrastructure where they would be able to operate as COVID continues. If you can share some of those experiences.
Working in an environment such as this one through COVID and dealing with the vendors and trying to keep everybody safe was one of those things that this answers Kim's question as well. That I would change. I never want to have to do something like this through COVID again, do something like COVID again. In terms of our resilience, brain's drawing a blank. These Director, you threw me for a sec.
So some of the things that we would have worked on and you would have worked on directly was to get a transformation from what we're seeing now with the very close spaces, persons that are not socially distant, persons with not as sanitary conditions as they would have wanted, to what you would have shown in the other slides, showing phase 1 having separated stalls and not continuous units as they were before. Persons who are now under more sanitary conditions, where there's space between food preparation and the customer as it was before. So we would have had best practices, having actual bathroom facilities where there were portable toilets before, having hot water, having food handling standards that were higher than they were before. So those types of things that would affect a COVID environment where they are now in that space compared to what they were before, just sharing those types of best practices so we can understand the transition of, and bringing it back to the theme of the conference, beyond COVID, especially the component about recovery and resilience.
Okay, now in following, because the brain just went completely blank. In this scenario, this photo actually shows one of these scenarios. We took this facility from an original enclosed facility. And because of COVID, one of the challenges was how do we physically distance but socially interact, keep people socially interactive. And this facility, because it's outdoors, it allows for that to happen. So should we have an outbreak, heaven forbid, we never have that again, of a highly contagious illness, it would minimize the downtime of these vendors, because I don't know, I don't have a pointer that can really show you here, but the stalls are oriented in such a way that there is minimal interaction between the side-by-side vendors. So what's happening at my stall should not affect my neighbor, and vice versa. The patrons themselves, however, can transition easily between the spaces. The vendors, per their request wanted this open promenade. And the site has a free airflow going through it at all times. So they are not constrained by any confined space. And that is one of those future planning things. We also didn't mention in the presentation that they wanted it fully as an event space. I don't know if persons are familiar with the Q in the community type activity that happens in Barbados. They specifically said we want to have Q here. So this space again allows it to do so. With the solar lighting, it takes it off grid. So should there be any issues, this site can be used for feeding. Should we have a natural disaster, for example, a hurricane, the site survived Hurricane Elsa, we had no flooding, we didn't have any issues. So we're looking at having built that resilience in, should the site need to be rapidly deployed for another service, it can be with consultation with the vendors, however. Does that answer?
Thanks, Joy. I'd like to just make a general point, picking up on something Joy said about the open air nature of the facility and the fact that air flows through it. It is obviously related to a situation where we have respiratory type spread disease. So one of the advantages that we actually have in the Caribbean is that we can do a lot of things outside. We can adjust our living so that our houses are more naturally ventilated. We can, some of us have space to recreate leisure activities outside of our homes, even within the boundary. Now, the issue with that is it's obviously easier for people who've got more money than people who've got less money, because they can afford the space, which I think we need to bear in mind. And in developing in the future, we need to make sure that there are open spaces available to everybody. So the outside recreation is available. If for no other reason, because it's not just physical health that's hampered by things like lockdown, it's mental health as well. Getting out and doing something outside where you're at a safe distance is actually much more workable. And I've got a general ambition for Bridgetown in that I want to see more people moving back into Bridgetown. And I want to see Bridgetown becoming much more of a mixed class community than it's become. What's happened to Bridgetown has happened to lots of cities across the Caribbean and the world, in that a lot of jobs have moved out to the suburbs and a lot of people have moved out to the suburbs. So you end up with the people who haven't got those jobs to go to. We need to get people back in there who can, amongst other things, provide jobs for the people who are there already. And I'd like to see that happen. And I think that should be one of our big ambitions for Bridgetown, and probably for other cities in the Caribbean as well, so that they become livable places again, but places which are lived in too. Okay.
Let me just, what I will say to you is that what we were able to do quite successfully is by hiring smaller contractors, they themselves turned around and hired staff. So one contractor will be constrained with how much staff he can have. But by hiring several contractors, we increase the number of persons employed on the site, or employable in theory. And many of those persons did come from the surrounding housing districts within Bridgetown, which unfortunately they trended to be the lower income housing districts, but we were able to employ persons from the surrounding areas into the site. So people feel, I had a hand in this, I am going to continue to do something like this.
That's absolutely brilliant. And I'd like to, it's where there might have been an economic advantage in having one big contractor. There might have been a time advantage in having one big contractor, but there's a huge social advantage in having the smaller number of contractors. And I'd like to see that applied to a lot more things. I'd like to see, even when the big contractors are involved, that there are conditions in their contracts that they have to do local employment, but more to the point, because they can probably afford it better, they need to fund training so that the workers who come in and do a particular job then have a skill which they can go and sell to somebody else. Okay. Right, I don't think, do we have any more? We have another question that's come in on the chat, which again says, have you considered integrating sustainability or green building principles and concepts to inform new design standards in this or other projects? And this is Petal J again.
Traditional Barbadian shackle house vernacular is a cooler, greener type of build. it keeps it, back when the chattel houses were in vogue, we didn't really have the electricity or whatever. The houses were cool. They had free airflow. And these were the design principles when we started to look at this project. How were we going to integrate those principles into it? So unfortunately, because of certain regulatory requirements around food, they had to be sealed. So we could not have what we call the jalousies, which are throughout the Caribbean in its architectural vernacular. So we had to take that out, but we replicated it. So that's why the shiplap Plycem boarding is there to at least replicate that and keep it there. They're lighter structures that we're going up in phase 2. Phase 1 is the concrete because it's food, but we're going into the fruit and veg and the general purpose. Lighter structures. We tried to integrate more solar power, but because each stall had to be individually metered and the requirements for each vendor, the cost benefit wasn't there for us in this way to have each vendor attached to their own solar panel. However, the site, there are plans for the site to have solar panels installed on the roofs of the structures, where the cost generated from the electricity generated will then turn around and run the overall site, because sites like this require maintenance, they require cleaning, general cleaning, pest control, those kinds of things. So that is something that is in train, but it has not yet been installed. We tried water harvesting as well, but again, the site is small. We considered where would we put the water tanks for the harvested water, then for using for sanitation, etc. But again, the site tossed water storage versus the actual construction of a stall. A vendor needs a space to operate from. So these were the issues that we had.
Right, I think we can add to that the roof angle is a traditional roof angle. Not only does it fit the look of the vernacular, but it serves a tremendous purpose in terms of dealing with high winds. That type of roof survives much better than a low-angled, flattish roof in the event of a hurricane. And again, we can actually learn a lot from the past. Things were done by people who lived defensively. Okay, I just check if there's please, one more question from the hall.
My question relates to the number of stakeholders that were involved in the process. I recognize that, as from your presentation, you would have indicated they were stakeholders from the government sector as well as the private sector. And given the number of stakeholders that you utilize, I just wondered what your feedback was so far for phase 1, for example, and the stakeholder that I would most like to hear about in relation to the feedback would be the vendors. I know you visit almost every week to the site, so I was just wondering about the type of feedback that you get from the vendors and how they feel about the infrastructure and the upgrade that they would have received from the Fairchild Street Market project.
A project like this is not going to be without complaint. So the vendor's primary complaint at this time is sun. Now, something that I have heard repeated in many presentations this week is the fact that we are in the tropics. So the sun is going to shift, and the sun is going to shift at different times of the year. So some vendors are affected by the sun at different times of the afternoon, but that is not the same vendor each time. As the sun moves on its movement every year, the different vendors are affected at different times. So we're working with the architect at the moment to look for a sunshade that is resilient enough to everyday use, because moving parts require more maintenance and more costs, that will help deal with the vendors and their patrons who don't want the sun. Some have also complained about when the rain falls, water moving, but we have rain gutters and we're trying to channel the water away. But again, we're in the tropics, so we either have hot sun or heavy rain for the most part, or rainfall. But for the most part, though, the vendors are happy to have been put in a place that is more sanitary. It's safer, they can lock it up. One of the comments most heard yesterday at the site visit was, the vendors have curtains up, like they've made it their homes. So the vendors have customized these spaces to make it feel their own castle. They've really taken pride in it. So while they don't like the heat and the sun, they enjoy the spaces that they're in. In addition, we wanted to have more greenery on the site because we soften everything with landscape, with plants, with trees. It helps make it cooler, all of these things. However, user habits do not allow us to increase it, to bring in more greenery to the site. User habits, there'll be plants won't survive. So unfortunately, we have to constrain our landscaping to the edges of the site and not to the center. That I think is the biggest regret that I have with the site itself. But we design with the users and the vendors and not for them. If we were to design for them, we kill the plants and waste money. So.
Right, thank you. Any more questions from the room? Oh, in that case, and there's not another question on the chat, I'm going to ask each of the presenters to make a final summing up statement. And I've just checked that Crystal is online still. So I'd like to go to her first, please. Let us know what you would give us as a final message to go away from today's session, please, Crystal.
Good afternoon again, and thank you so much for having me. My take-home statement is to ensure that any program does at least the yearly evaluation and not just paper evaluation, not just an annual review, not just a financial evaluation, but to talk to its people. What they say matters. Staff, volunteers, partners, it's important to have adaptive management. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Crystal. And Joy, would you like to leave us with a final message, please?
I would support Crystal in her statement. We could not have created what you see at Fairchild Street without speaking with people. We had to listen, and even having seen what happened at phase 1 and how the vendors felt at phase 1, now that we've moved on to phase 2 and its construction, we have to take what the vendors' experience is now to make sure that we don't have any issues or to minimize those issues going into phase 2. The parking, how do they get their supplies and their stock? The stock now comes every day rather than once a week. It comes now every day because they have greater access to the delivery vehicles, etc. So talking to people, making sure that we evaluate everything that we're doing, to make sure that every stage we improve, and then we take these lessons learned onto our other projects, etc. So that's my lessons learned.
Okay, thank you, Joy. Thank you, Crystal. And thank you both for extremely interesting presentations, and presentations which centered in on that key issue of talking to people and finding out what really matters on the ground, and coming up with solutions that match those, and working with people to choose those solutions rather than imposing things from above. So in closing, I'd like to give my thanks to the two speakers for what they've given us this afternoon, which has been excellent. I'd like to thank the audience for coming and the questions that have come in both in the audience here in the room and on the chat. And I'd like to thank our technical team for what they've done in coping with some of the problems that we have with overstretched communications across the Caribbean. So thank you very much indeed for all your assistance. Thank you.